Hey guys, welcome to Calgary Barbell. We're gonna go through a little bit of my mobility routine today, the warm-up that I do before every session, to talk a little bit about what it is, where I got it from, and why I do it. I got it from my physio, Rory Alter, through RTS, and she's prescribed this specifically for my hip dysfunction to help me mobilize my hips and make sure everything's moving properly before I do my training sessions. And I also try to get this in on my off days just to make sure I maintain that same level of mobility through my hips. Now, this routine is focused predominantly on lower body. You'll notice I don't really do a whole lot of upper body mobility. My shoulders seem to be in fairly good health, and I usually just sort of do a couple sets of empty bar with the bench. And you know, if I have to smash something with a lacrosse ball or stretch the band a little bit, that's fine. But the routine that I'm going to go through does enough of my upper body that it allows me to do everything that I need to do when it comes to getting under the bar for squats and that kind of stuff. So I wanted to mention that this isn't necessarily something that everybody should be doing. This is something I've had people asking me what I do, so that's what I'm going to show you guys. If you find some movements through here, through this sort of video today, if you find some stuff that works for you, great. But I'm not saying this is the warm-up that you need to do or this is the mobility that you need to do. This is simply what I do, and hopefully you guys can try some of these movements out, and if you find that they work for you, or if you find the concept of moving from a less intense to a more intense stretch in your warm-up helps, then you can take some of that away and incorporate that into your own routine. I think it's important to take it with a grain of salt, right? Try some stuff. If it works, cool. If it doesn't, don't bother. Try some other stuff. Look at some other people's routines, some other people's warm-ups and mobility. Try some of that stuff. If it works, cool. If it doesn't, get rid of it. And that way you can sort of make your own and not necessarily just copy what works for me, because that's not necessarily what's going to work for you. So the first thing we're going to do, the first part of my mobility routine, is to do some foam rolling with both a foam roller and a lacrosse ball. Now I'll do that in the soft tissue structures of my hips, try and get things a little bit more pliable and ready to move. Really, when I'm foam rolling, I'm gonna spend anywhere between 20 to 40 seconds, maybe up to a minute if something's feeling particularly sticky. But generally, I just wanna get things feeling a little bit less sensitive than when they start off with. That's generally a decent indicator that you're starting to see some tissues loosen up a little bit there. After I've got my IT band sufficiently loosened, what I'll then do is move further up that chain into the glute. Now I like to roll with my hip externally rotated like that, so I feel like I can get a little bit deeper into that sort of glute med piriformis area where I tend to get a lot of my symptoms. So you'll see I'll just sort of work back and forth on that posterior and lateral hip with my leg up in this position here. The last thing that I'll foam roll with this is going to be my quads and up into my hip flexors. Now I like to use a little bit of, I guess you could call it like an ART kind of technique. So when I get up to my hip flexors, you'll notice I flex my glutes a little bit to get more extension in my hip and expose that psoas and whatever else is going to be in there. The final thing that I'll do rolling wise is I'll use a softball to get into the more deep tissues directly around my SI joint, where a lot of my issues come from, and I find that gives me a little bit of relief and a little bit more mobility. The next thing we're going to do after we get our tissues nice and pliable and rolled out is a little bit of twerking, or as it's commonly called, cat-cow. Essentially all you want to do here is exaggerate flexion and extension through as much of your spine as you can. Next, I'll go into what's called child's pose. I'll do that for about 20-25 seconds or so straight on, and then I'll cross over right and left and spend about 20 seconds in either one of those positions as well. So this is probably one of my favorite movements. I imagine it's called the Sideline Rotation or something like that. But essentially what I'm trying to do is trying to get into a similar position to where you would perform clamshells from. And then essentially I'm keeping my lower body pointed in one direction while I open up my upper body and sort of relax my core. I usually get a good crack, good adjustment out of my low back in this one, which feels really good. And I also find this is a pretty useful one for helping open up my shoulders. Now I'll probably do anywhere between 8 and 12 reps per side of this one. And the third part, and probably the biggest part time-wise, is going to be some static stretching. So I work through both posterior and anterior hip, and I work from less intense static stretching to more intense static stretching. So the way that I work from least intense to most intense is I simply add sort of assistance or external pressure. So for example, with my hip flexor stretch, I start off simply using my glute to stretch my hip flexor. And then I start using a bench behind me, the couch stretch, to stretch my hip flexor. And then the third phase or final portion of my hip flexor stretching is to actually use a band to add more resistance and pull in a very specific plane of motion. So you guys will see all that as we go through it. We'll get a little bit more specific. So here we go. Now, in what Rory originally sent me, apparently you're supposed to be able to reach through and grab onto your leg and pull this up, but I think that's crazy talk. So I use a rack like this one, and I kind of straddle it, and then I'll use sort of the weight of my body trying to get my back flat to push into this stretch, and then I'll move my knee back and forth to either intensify or lessen the stretch. Now for each of these static stretches until the last one, and I'll mention this again when we get there, but it's going to be about 20 or 30 seconds held per side. For the sake of not repeating myself, each stretch will be 20 to 30 seconds held per side. And after I stretch my posterior hip, I'll move to anterior hip, mostly hip flexors. Now with the less intense stretch where we're starting now, I'm going to be using simply the contraction of my glute and the drawing in of my abs and my core musculature to stretch the front of my hip out. If I want a little bit more intense, I can reach up to sort of pull the rib cage up, and again just sort of flexing my glute, pulling my abs in. 20 or 30 seconds here. So I probably don't really need to explain how to get into this one. You just kind of lay your foot across the bench and try to find tension in your glute. Next up, we have what's commonly referred to as the couch stretch. So again, we're just using our body weight and the bench to assist us in intensifying the stretch of the hip flexors. We want to be making sure we're squeezing the glute, drawing the abs in here as well. Next up, we have pretty much our only upper body focused stretch, and that's going to be to stretch the lats out a little bit. As you can see, I'm just kind of grabbing on and hanging off of something. And the final stretch we're going to do is we're going to use the band to further intensify the hip flexor stretch. And we're going to hold this last stretch for 1 minute per side, and that's it. Then we grab the barbell. So thanks for watching today, guys. Again, I really appreciate getting these kinds of suggestions. If there's more things you want me to go in depth into in my training, my warm-ups, my cool-downs, never mind, I don't cool down. But if there's anything specifically you want me to highlight from my training, please continue to let me know. We enjoy making these videos. We enjoy tailoring our content to what you guys are looking for. If you like the video, like it. Thanks to everybody who's subscribed so far, and we will see you guys next time.